Hi, I want to welcome everyone. This is Mr. Van Scoten from Sanctuary Hill in Mid-City, Los Angeles. I hope you're having a good day. Today we're going to be talking about the New Deal, and so it seemed appropriate to me to ask this question. How does the federal government impact you? So while you're thinking about that, let me say a few words about the Great Depression. We talked about it last week, and we were talking about the causes of the Great Depression, starting with the stock market crash. And we were also talking about some of the measures Hoover took in order to combat the Great Depression and how most of those were futile. There was no economic relief, which is why we have to now talk about FDR, the man who replaced Hoover in 1933. This is when he took the oath of office. Under Roosevelt, there was a vast expansion of the federal government. Um, and we'll talk about the different ways in which it grew. In many ways, he created a federal government that we would recognize today. We're living with that big government. Any Republican or conservative will probably, or libertarian for that matter, will tell you that. Um, so, how did we come to get such a huge government? How does the federal government impact us? And so, let me tell you a few things I put down. I brainstormed this question last night. So here are the few things I came up with. One of the things that stood out to me, having been a student and relied upon financial aid, was that the federal government provides federal student aid, Stafford loans, other types of loans. These are critical, of course, for millions of Americans. They have been critical for many years, since the 60s. I believe that's when the government got in on this. And of course, that's very much an issue now, right? About the amount of money that is being spent and being lent to students and the people who manage those loans and the interest they charge on it. Other ways that the federal government impacts us, Social Security being perhaps the most important, other than the military itself. Yes, the federal government protects us. It's always protected us, right? But Social Security was new, and that came in under FDR in 1937. It also provides low interest loans, mortgages for people so that they can buy homes. That's sometimes the only way that many Americans can afford homes. It has supplied dams, extensive federal dam systems that supply electricity throughout the country. Another way, finally, and we won't go through the whole list, but the VA is a federal institution. It takes care of our vets. Sometimes it does that well, sometimes not so well. But in any case, it's there. Notice it prints money, it manages and maintains the interstate highway system. The U.S. Weather Service is involved in it. Whenever we hear about the FBI, that's a branch of the Department of Justice, and that's the federal government. So I want students to be aware of just how pervasive the impact, the influence of the federal government is on our lives. The U.S. Great Depression, it begins in 1929. The part that we'll look at in this lecture is 1933 to 1941. These are a few aspects, these images of the Great Depression. You have the migrant workers on the lower left in their runabout. That was probably the only thing they owned other than the clothes that you see. There were billboards like the one on the upper left here. Jobless men keep going. Joblessness had only increased and deepened throughout 1931, 32, 33. A cartoon in the upper right shows a man holding cards in his hand. Each card was a particular measure that Franklin Delano Roosevelt would try in order to combat the Depression. And then one of his many administrations, many of his many regulatory bodies, the National Recovery Administration. You see a woman putting up a poster in the shop window. So we'll talk about some of the programs he set forth. Right. We've talked about the causes of the Great Depression. I'm not going to labor too long on this, but I do want to refresh people's memories. It wasn't one cause that led to this economic tailspin. It was several. One of them was, of course, the Great Crash. We talked about that. Another one was the concentration of wealth in a few hands. Economic prosperity rested in a handful of key industries: RCA, Ford, US Steel, GM. And when these began to have problems, then the entire economy had problems. Another cause of the Depression was that there was very little good data on the stock market, on businesses, on how well they were capitalized, on how much their stock was truly worth. Today, we have almost too much information, right? And it's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But back then, people were more or less operating in the dark. So poor economic intelligence or data led in part to the crash. And then finally, a fundamental misunderstanding of how the economy worked. It's not that we have a complete understanding of the economy today, but back in 1929, 1933, when Roosevelt takes office, they were even more clueless. They believed they understood it, which perhaps made the problem all the worse because they really didn't, right? They weren't aware of their ignorance. All right, the election of 1932 is critical. It's one of the critical elections in U.S. history. There's a handful of them. In 1932, the Democrats had been out of office for some time since Woodrow Wilson. There had only been two Democratic presidents since the Civil War. So the presidency had definitely been a monopoly of the Republican Party. The election of 1932 changed all that. FDR won handily, overwhelmingly in a landslide. And he was to win again, in fact, 3 more times in landslides. He was going to be reelected. And that will probably never happen again, especially now that there's a law, right, that limits presidents to 2 terms. He won overwhelmingly. He won the electoral vote. He won the popular vote. And more importantly, he won Congress, because it's one thing as an executive to win the White House, but unless you have a compliant Congress, you can't really get much done. All you have to do is talk to former President Obama, a good example of a Democrat in office, unable to pass almost anything because Congress was controlled by Republicans. Well, in the case of FDR, the Democrats won 2/3 of a majority in the Senate, and they won 3/4 of a majority in the House. Things looked really good for quick, even radical change. FDR had to wait several months before he could take office. This was mandated in the Constitution. But at this critical moment in US history, it made many people extremely nervous because nothing got done. While the crisis deepened, Hoover and FDR refused to work together, not that they could have. Hoover proposed several laws, and FDR made no movement to support any of them. Because, of course, Hoover was poison. Hoover was political poison, and FDR was going to start with a clean slate with his own programs. He had to wait, though, until March. Eventually, after this election, they changed that rule, and so that now presidents can take the oath of office in February. And again, precisely because of problems like this. We have to talk about FDR the man. You see in the upper left a very young FDR. I always love photos of the presidents when they were young men. Photos of Theodore Roosevelt, for instance, when he was young are amazing. They're arresting because you can't see the old man or the older man in those photos. So you kind of see a different type of person. FDR was very young when he began to enter public office. He, in the middle photo, married his cousin, 5 times removed, Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt came from one branch of this very old American Dutch family, the Roosevelts. Her branch of it was called the Oyster Bay Roosevelts. The other branch is the Hyde Park Roosevelts, and it was from that branch that Roosevelt came, FDR. You see a photo finally on the lower left of sort of a middle-aged presidential Roosevelt. What's striking about this photo is that how many photos before those of Roosevelt showed presidents smiling? And this was, I think, again, important to explaining his popularity. He was a president who was approachable. And in the photos, in the newsreels that you see of him, he seems relaxed. He's talking to Americans. He's smiling a good deal. this won, I think, over millions of Americans, just this fact, the impression he gave of sort of joviality and familiarity. All right. He was, and had rather, a very, what would you call it? A very solicitous mother, a mother who was constantly hovering over him, partly because FDR was her only son. So, in a sense, we have an instance now of a helicopter parent before that term was coined. She was important, I think, to the shaping of FDR in many ways, both good and bad. She filled him with a belief that he could do anything and be anything. And that confidence, of course, was going to hold him in good stead when he became president. But his mother was also very demanding. And so he found ways to kind of get around, to sidestep her authority. At night, sometimes he would tie sheets together and climb out of his second story bedroom window and run off to the river that you see in that middle photo. That's the Hudson. In fact, I've taken the path that he took as a young boy. I visited Hyde Park, and you can take that path to the Hudson. It's an absolutely beautiful trail. The river is majestic and calm and beautiful. And he would run off in the middle of the night and spend time there. And in the morning, he would return just in time so that his mother didn't find out what he was doing. And when asked how he slept, he would say that he slept fine. Good night. So he learned to be duplicitous. Maybe that's a word, the right word for it. And that also would be useful to him in politics, as we'll see. He had political experience. He was the Secretary of the Navy. He was a vice presidential nominee during the 20s. And then when he runs for office, he's governor of New York. And as governor, he began to test out various programs that he would eventually implement on the federal level. An important thing to know about FDR is that he had polio. You wouldn't know that from the photographs. He never allowed himself to be shot with his braces, the braces on his legs, or to a photo of him being carried by one of his handlers. He was a man who wanted to project power. All men do, perhaps. In this case, he's running for president. He was struck with polio in 1920-21. And one of the great stories, I think, is that how he overcame it in many ways, how he ran in a dark period, projecting power and vitality in spite of the polio. And many people, of course, believe that the polio was important to the building of his character, and I have no doubt that it was. He was friendly. That lower left photo shows a friendly, approachable president, a man who cares about you. But he was also extremely shrewd, and you have to be, right, if you're president of the United States. Otherwise, you really are not president, right? Your cabinet is, or your kitchen cabinet, or whatever you want to call it. All right, the first New Deal, let's get to it. He takes the oath of office in March of 1933, at perhaps the darkest period in the nation's history since 1861, when Lincoln took the oath. And the country was already divided, and a number of states had already broken away. These first 100 days became famous. They were called the first 100 days. And they're famous because more legislation was passed in those 100 days than at any other time under any other president. And again, partly and perhaps overwhelmingly because the Democrats controlled Congress and they had a Democratic president. Also because of the urgency of the situation that demanded action. And of course, he had run on the proposition that action was necessary and he would take it. He sought two important goals, at least in the first New Deal. What you should know is that there isn't just one New Deal, there's two, and they both had different objects, two aims in mind, and they had different achievements as well. We'll talk about each. But the first one sought recovery, and it sought relief. Immediate relief of those who are hungry or homeless or both. And then a recovery of the economy, the recovery of farms, the recovery of factories and industries, small businesses, middle-sized businesses, and large businesses. And so to attack this problem in those 100 days, he passed one bill after another. And they're known as sort of alphabet soup, the alphabet soup of the New Deal. And I think that's an accurate name for it. The CCC, the Civil Conservation Corps, the AAA, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the NRA, the National Recovery Administration, the NRA. They just sort of all blend into one, unfortunately. Try to remember a few of these, the most important, and I'll try to point those out. You passed the Glass-Steagall Act. The Glass-Steagall Act was an act that basically forbid banks from becoming investment banks, from using money that citizens put into the bank in order to speculate on the stock market. The FDIC is Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. It guarantees savings that Americans put into the banks, a key measure at a time when most Americans had lost almost all they had in the banks, in their savings and checking accounts. And so this was a critical measure, but it was also indicative of, I think, an assumption behind much of the New Deal, which was that the federal government had to intervene in the affairs of the citizenry and create regulation and create bureaucracy that would protect citizens from economic downturns, protect them from foreclosures and what have you. So, in other words, take a personal interest in the citizen and create what is eventually going to be called the social safety net. All right, 15 pieces of major legislation was passed. In many cases, the bills were read within several days before the vote. That's about it. Many people didn't know what they were voting on. That should sound familiar because that's a common criticism of both parties when it comes to laws passed today. That there isn't enough time to actually read what these complicated bills have in them. Anyway, they had nothing on FDR and Congress at that time. First, the New Deal was about saving the banks, and this was key because unless you could make the financial system of the United States secure, no one would invest their money in anything. And that had been the problem under Hoover. Now, how do you attack it? I've already mentioned the Glass-Steagall Act. One is you get the banks out of speculating on the stock market. But there were other things. Immediately, the very first act passed by FDR was an Emergency Banking Act. And the logic behind the Banking Act was simple. It was basically to close all of the banks down and to go through the books, make sure that they were solvent, make sure that the banks that weren't solvent were closed down. And then to reopen them, make an announcement to Americans that the banks were now safe, that they could deposit their money in them, or if the money was still there, and we hope that it was, that they could keep it there, right? Because the money that you and I give to banks is then loaned out to other people and to other businesses, right? It greases the wheels of commerce. FDR realized that. It wasn't a secret. But no one had taken such a invasive step, taking the federal government and basically closing down a private industry. Think about that. That was unheard of. Many people were up in arms about this. They talked about socialism. They talked about authoritarianism. Anyway, at the end of the day, it was exceptionally successful. People had confidence again. More importantly, they had an example of a president who, true to his word, acted on the very first day in office and was working round the clock in order to create relief, instant relief to them, for them. Another important act was the Glass-Steagall Act, 1933. And as I said, it separated commercial and investment banks. It has recently been overturned. The FDIC, again, guaranteed deposits that people made to banks and therefore gave them confidence that money would be there when they needed it. And finally, momentously, I say momentously, the gold standard ended. If you remember about the populists, if you remember about an earlier Great Depression, starting in 1873 and going all the way up until 1893, remember that the Populist Party basically was born out of that depression. And one of the remedies it put forth was the idea that there was not enough currency in the economy. People couldn't pay their debts, and therefore the country should go off the gold standard and bring in silver currency as well. So gold and silver currency. That was shot down, as we know, the 1896, another critical election, the 1896 election. saw the defeat of that bill. But now we see eventually that the populists were redeemed. Their measure was accepted. The gold standard was instituted in 1933, and we've been off it ever since. What that has also meant, of course, is that the United States can publish and issue as much money as it wishes. All right, so FDR's recovery measure. One of them was the National Recovery Administration, and this was the Blue Eagle. I showed you an image of it, a woman sort of putting up a poster in a shop window. She was part of the NRA. The National Recovery Administration was an attempt to funnel billions of dollars of money into both sort of small, middle, and large corporations, but especially family businesses, in order to jumpstart recovery. Another important measure was the National Industrial Recovery Act. And as its title suggests, it was meant to bring back industries that had been hurt over the last 3 years, particularly steel, the railroads, and also coal. You had the Agricultural Adjustment Act. This was an act that was aimed at farmers, as you might expect. And what it did was it tried to attack the two key problems that had been dogging farmers, I would say, all the way back to 1870, and that was overproduction. That was one. And then falling prices for what they produced. How do you attack that? Well, what the Agricultural Adjustment Act did was to pay farmers to produce less, to cultivate fewer things in the field, fewer crops. That sounds rather odd, but it actually did work. It did work. It was a very controversial act because at a time of mass hunger, very often under this act, pigs were slaughtered. Young pigs were slaughtered so that the price of pork would go up. There would be less supply, and that would create more demand. It would raise prices. Same thing with milk. Thousands of gallons of milk was poured into rivers and creeks by farmers, dairy farmers, who, under the Agricultural Adjustment Act, were being paid in order not to market their product. Think of that. Anyway, what was the reasoning again behind this madness? It was again to raise the prices by limiting supply. It was a temporary act. Anyway, that was part of the recovery measure. Another measure was the CCC. This was a measure to employ millions of young men, for the most part, in sort of an army, a national army, that went forth to create new national parks, to maintain old ones, to create fire trails, to chop wood, to do really anything that needed to be done, to build bridges in the countryside usually. So the Civilian Conservation Corps was a way that workers for a few dollars a day could support their families through the hard times by, again, working on public works, parks, and other important federal properties. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration was just what it says here. It was a way of giving relief to any number of businesses, mostly industries, small businesses. And then the FHA. People were losing their homes at a record number. They had been losing their homes under Hoover. And so what the FHA did under Roosevelt was to offer them low interest mortgages that would allow them to refinance the mortgages they already had and therefore keep their homes. So it was a measure aimed at ending or at least ameliorating homelessness. It too was very effective. We still have the FHA today. You see some of these images. The New Deal was a bonanza for artists who made posters like the one you see on the upper right here. Cartoonists had some fun, of course, with FDR. In this case, you had a pro-FDR cartoon showing that FDR is a painter and he's going to paint this barn that's covered, splattered with poverty, with high prices, and with general chaos. So he's coming with his relief programs in order to give a new coat of paint to the American economy. He finally passed the Securities and Exchange Commission. And when I talked about data, financial data, and not having a lot of it at the time of the crash in 1929, the SEC was an attempt to undo this. In other words, to make sure that if anyone issued stock, they had to present data. They had to fill out forms. They had to make known, in other words, to the public what their financial situation was, whether they were making profits, whether the stock was worth anything at all, how much, how much reserves they had. So the SEC, and of course we have the SEC today as well. All right, the Civilian Conservation Corps. I thought it was a good time to maybe stop here and take a breath. Before we come back, I want you to take a look at this photo. This is of a camp in the South. I believe this is North Carolina. These were all people who were employed under the Civilian Conservation Corps. If they look like a military unit, that's often what they were compared with. Remember, there were millions of young people who were unemployed. And as a leader of a country, as the leader of a nation, that's an unruly element, or it can be. These are the people who are going to join fanatical fringe organizations who will become desperate. They have a lot of energy. They can get into a lot of trouble. And so part of what the Civilian Conservation Corps was to sort of truck these people out to the countryside, but also to employ them and to pay them so that they could therefore send money back to their families. And that also, of course, would be relief, direct relief. But notice it wasn't socialism. They were getting paid. They were doing work. They were improving the infrastructure of the United States. As I said, most of the Civilian Conservation Corps, these units were in the countryside. And you can still see their work today. All right, let me pause it there, and we'll come back and pick up the second part of the New Deal.